What's up, biology students? Today's video is about cell theory, which explains how these little things called cells relate to the bigger picture of what it means to be alive. According to cell theory, all living things are composed of cells, every single one. We can even determine what kind of life form we are dealing with by looking only at its cells. Here we see an example using three of the most basic cell types: bacterial cells, animal cells, and plant cells. As you can see, some of these cells are more similar than others, and we can further classify these cells into two even more basic categories: prokaryotes and eukaryotes. This cell, the bacterial cell, is a prokaryote, and here we see some of the defining features of prokaryotic cells. They are smaller in size than eukaryotic cells, they reproduce asexually, they lack internal membranes, and therefore have no cellular organelles. Consequently, they have no nucleus, and their DNA is free-floating inside the cell. Although some prokaryotes live as colonies of cells, all prokaryotes are also unicellular, meaning that every prokaryotic organism is composed of only a single living cell. These two cells, the plant cell and animal cells, are eukaryotic cells. As you can see, there are some differences between plant and animal cells, but overall, they are far more similar to one another than either one is to a prokaryotic cell. Not all eukaryotes are multicellular, but many of them are, and many of them reproduce sexually. Some eukaryotes reproduce asexually, and some kinds, including many plants, are able to reproduce in both fashions. Eukaryotic cells are bigger than prokaryotes, and eukaryotes also have membrane-bound organelles. That's what all of these little structures are on the inside of these cells. They also have a cell nucleus that protects the cell's genetic information. Here we see a few examples of real-life plant cells. We have fast-growing root tip cells, cells containing chloroplasts for photosynthesis, some cells from the skin of an onion, and these guard cells around the pore in a leaf. These cells will close this opening if they get too dry, preventing this plant from losing water. We can tell that all of these are eukaryotic cells because each contains a nucleus, and we can tell that they are plant cells because of the thick, rigid cell walls. These green structures are also where photosynthesis occurs, and that too can tell us that some of these are plant cells. But not all plant cells photosynthesize, so not all plants have these structures. Animal cells, on the other hand, appear quite a bit differently. Here we see muscle cells, red and white blood cells, and skin cells. And these are also eukaryotic, but unlike plant cells, they do not have cell walls, only a cell membrane. This one here isn't really an animal, but it's not really a plant either. It's a single-celled organism called an amoeba. Unlike muscle cells or blood cells, which on their own don't constitute a whole organism, this amoeba lives as just one cell, and that one cell is able to perform all the basic functions of life. We don't get much of an opportunity to learn about fungi in high school biology, but fungi are also eukaryotes, and like all living organisms, are also made out of cells. Fungal cells are distinct in their own way, often very long and narrow, and many of them contain multiple nuclei contained in the same cytoplasm. But they are actually more similar to animal cells than they are to plant cells, even though some fungi look and behave more like plants on a superficial level. They also play a very important role as decomposers in almost every ecosystem. Then there's the invisible part of our biosphere, the organisms among us that we do not see unless we look for them through a microscope. We call these microbes, and they are literally everywhere, even inside of us, like in our guts, for example, helping us to break down food. And they too are made of cells. Much smaller, much simpler cells, mind you, but cells nonetheless, because all living things, from bacteria to baboons, are made of cells. Cell theory also states that cells are the basic units of structure and function in living things. Basically, this means that cells are the smallest units of life because they perform all the basic functions of life, like taking in nutrients and transforming energy, metabolizing molecules and getting rid of waste. Cells even reproduce and grow and develop over time. But the smaller parts that make up a cell's, molecules, organelles, and what have you, do not perform all of these functions on their own, and are not considered alive as a result. Here we can see a few of these basic units of life: muscle cells and nerve cells, or neurons. Each of these cells performs all the functions of life, but they also have their own unique, specialized functions as well. Muscle cells can contract to generate movement, and neurons can conduct electrical impulses to send and receive signals from other cells. And just like you can combine a bunch of Lego bricks to make a castle, living organisms combine cells like these to form tissues and organs, like hearts made from muscle cells and brains made from neurons. We've also got some basic units of plant life here too. In this case, these basic units of life that we call cells have arranged themselves into a leaf, each one performing all the basic functions of life, and each also specialized to do a particular job inside this plant, much like muscle cells are specialized to do certain jobs in our bodies. Cell theory also tells us that new cells are produced from existing cells. Before the microscope was invented, there was this idea called spontaneous generation, which said that some organisms spontaneously generated or suddenly appeared out of nowhere if the conditions were right. For example, if you left meat out on the counter, maggots would appear out of nowhere several days later. If you left bread out, mold would suddenly appear. What they couldn't see at the time were the fly eggs that had been laid on the meat and the mold spores that had fallen onto the bread. The eggs hatched, and that's where the maggots came from, and the spores grew into the mold that consumed the bread. These living organisms, made of cells, came from other living organisms also made of cells, who reproduced to produce the new individuals based on their own cells. It took experiments like the one shown in this picture to finally prove that things like maggots and mold don't suddenly appear out of nowhere. How old cells produce new cells varies somewhat depending on whether you're a prokaryote or a eukaryote, but cells are capable of replicating themselves. On a basic level, this is what we call asexual reproduction. That is, reproduction by way of cell division only, and not based on the combination of cells and genes from two separate organisms of the same species. Prokaryotic cells divide by binary fission. Eukaryotic cells divide by way of mitosis, which is the division of the nucleus, and cytokinesis, which is the division of the cytoplasm. It is one of these two ways that cells use to reproduce themselves and make new cells. The interesting part about cell theory is that it makes no effort to explain where the very first cells came from. There are plenty of ideas about how they came about, some scientific and some not, but those are theories for another day. Suffice it to say that wherever the first cells came from, according to cell theory, all other cells in existence today were produced by previous generations of cells, all the way back as far as we can go. In our own life, if we go back far enough, we find a single cell. If we go back just a bit further, we would find that this one cell was created from the fusion of two different cells, one egg cell and one sperm cell, each containing half the DNA necessary to build a complete human being. These two cells fuse to form one complete cell, called a zygote, and this is the cell on day 0 of our existence. No heart, no brain, no organs, or organ systems, just one generic cell. That cell divides to form 2 cells. Those 2 cells each divide to form 4 cells, then 8, then 16, and so on, over and over again. Eventually, these cells begin to specialize and take on specific jobs. They're no longer generic. They have specific functions in that organism's body. They begin to organize themselves into organs and organ systems, and those organ systems slowly come online and begin to function. All the cells that make up our body today originated from that one cell, because all new cells are produced from existing cells. In a big way, this theory started with the microscope, invented by Robert Hooke back in the 17th century. This device, which bears little resemblance to the high-tech microscopes we have today, opened a whole new world to scientists and helped us to discover what life is really made of. Other scientists, like Antony van Leeuwenhoek, improved upon Robert Hooke's original design, and the field of microbiology began to grow. Scientists like Leeuwenhoek documented their work carefully in writings and in drawings, and their discoveries became the knowledge upon which future scientists would base their work. Leeuwenhoek, for example, examined the cellular structure of many plants and animals and was the first to observe and describe what we now call microorganisms, living creatures too small to see with the naked eye. Still others, like German scientists Schwann and Schleiden, contributed to cell theory by contributing their observations about plant cells and embryos to the greater body of knowledge that was developing at the time. It was these two who proposed the first version of cell theory, but it is important to note that their work built upon the work of many others, and was continued by many others as well, who contributed even more to our understanding of the cellular basis of life. The original version of cell theory contains the 3 points we've already discussed: that all living things are made of cells, that cells are the basic units of structure and function in living things, and that cells arise from other cells. But modern cell theory goes further still. Modern cell theory also states that the activity of an organism depends on the activity of all the individual cells that make that organism. Basically, this means that what an organism is capable of doing depends on what the organism's cells are capable of doing. It also states that energy transformations due to metabolism and biochemistry occur within cells. That means that molecules are built and broken down, absorbing and releasing energy inside of our cells. It goes on to state that cells contain hereditary genetic information that is passed from cell to cell during cell division. This refers to DNA, the universal genetic code of life. And finally, modern cell theory states that all cells are basically the same in chemical composition in organisms of similar species. This means that all humans have cells that are chemically similar to other humans, while all pine trees have cells that are chemically similar to other pine trees. To understand life, we have to understand what life is made of, and all life is cellular. Prokaryotes and eukaryotes, bacteria and baboons, are pretty different, but they are all made of cells, and those cells can reproduce to make more cells, and those cells perform vital life functions to keep the organism alive and in homeostasis. And with that, I will bring our video to a close. Thanks for watching, everyone.